give you a high-level idea of what I hope you will walk away with. First of all, you should come away with an appreciation of how the display of measurements can significantly affect the effectiveness and correctness of those same measurements, even correctness, yes. An appreciation of how measurements are more than just the numbers, the mathematics. I want you to develop an understanding of the more commonly used types of graphical measurement displays, when each and several should be used, how they should be used, when and how not to use them. And also, I hope you will gain an understanding of some specific practical mathematical rules that you will use regularly when designing the graphs and the tables. I want you to get a few ideas. Obviously, time does not permit an entire career worth of ideas. Ideas to help you create measurement displays to speed up meetings and decision-making. Okay, this presentation is going to assume a paradigm that I've always used, or I shouldn't say always, let's say in the last 15 years, for the use of goal-driven measures. It's called goal question measure. I did not invent that. In this paradigm, goals are defined first, and they're followed by the key business questions that have to be answered in order to support the goals. And after you have defined and documented those key business questions supporting the goals, only then do you actually start designing what indicators, what measurement indicators, and these are graphical, are used in order to answer those questions. It's assumed here that the data to be displayed is for the purpose of informing well-articulated management decisions. Now, you will hear occasionally recommendations that might be different from the main purpose if you were doing a research project, where the level of detail in a research project and the time available to assimilate the information can be expected to be high. In this case, the approach we take is the information is to be presented efficiently and intuitively so that management can understand quickly and perform whatever decision-making role efficiently that they're viewing the measurements, for which they're viewing the measurements. Here's the agenda, the basic topics we're going to cover. Does display really matter? The trilogy of factors of performance measurement, well, any kind of measurement, math, art, and message. We'll have to cover some actual mathematics here, so get ready. Mathematical scales, types of graphical displays, the anatomy of a graph, use of color, and misleading display. A summary, of course. Now, first, does display really matter? Some people will say, hey, look, graphs are easy to create. It's automated. Why should I spend 2 hours in a webinar designing, or hours in applying what I've learned in the webinar, designing what has been easily automated? Or you might say, why should I spend an enormous amount of time in the class on the subject, having already said that? People are smart enough to figure out the details. Boy, I wish that were really true. Smart people are smart, but when we get to misleading display, you'll see what I mean. Here's a famous example of why really, really smart people presenting correct graphs can go terribly wrong. The Challenger disaster. In January of '86, Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart just over a minute into its flight, leading to the deaths of its 7 crew members, and the craft disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. The failure, now I'm going to oversimplify a little bit because it was a little complicated, but the fundamental failure was caused by an O-ring, which was made too brittle by the cold. A significant risk for this was predicted by the engineers for this launch based on the history of O-ring damage from previous cool weather launches, physics of resiliency, that is, the resiliency of the material declines exponentially as the temperature goes down, and actual experimental data with O-rings. That particular launch in 1986 was the only time to that date that the engineers recommended scrubbing a shuttle flight. Nevertheless, a decision to launch was made after a 3-hour teleconference in which poor presentation was made of available evidence. Now, that's not my opinion. That was in the presidential inquiry that followed. All right, here was, of many things, one of the graphs illustrated by the Presidential Commission that followed. This was an important graph that was presented to support whether or not to launch. You'll notice the vertical axis is how many damaged O-rings there were per launch. Each of these little designations here is the launch designation, the number of the launch. And each dot shows what the calculated joint temperature was in degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly approximately what the air temperature was. And how many, when the temperature was that, for example, here would be 53 degrees Fahrenheit, there were 3 incidences of damaged O-ring. Now, what went wrong? They actually looked at this graph and they plotted the curve and they said there was no correlation between temperature and those incidents of failure. Among many factors, the chart, this one in particular, never, believe it or not, never explicitly compared damage to temperature. It looks like it does, but it does not. This chart ignored all the launches where there was no apparent O-ring damage. You'll notice this 0 line down here corresponding to 0 incidents. There are no dots there. And clearly there were launches where there was no O-ring damage. Therefore, the implication, without really realizing it, this looks more like fraying, the border. In fact, that's the data line. It implies there were none. And certainly when you run a curve fitting, it will see, nothing there, and it will not take those into account. They weren't there. The graph was meant only to show launches with incidents, but its design implied more, both to the eye and to the curve fitting algorithms. So they couldn't see the true probability of the change with declining temperature. What's not visible here is every launch below 66 degrees Fahrenheit, every launch had some damage to O-rings. Now I've taken this graph and modified it to the degree that it would have actually displayed, without this bias, what the actual reality was. All right, so here's our original chart. I don't see the grid lines too much, but I hope you understand what we've got here. Here's the 0, 1, 2, 3, and here's a calculated joint temperature, and there's our existing dots. Now, you'll notice along the bottom, starting at the right, moving to the left, the additional lower dots indicate the temperature. Now, I had to do this because it's Excel when I made it, These are all at 0. This is how many there were. Here are all, without exclusion, all of the launches where the number of damaged O-rings was 0. This is all of them. Now, when I run the curve fitting algorithm, and I've seen this done, by the way, this was done by, the same thing was done by, H. Weiner. And I did it myself, not even trusting him, and I got the same curve. This is the curve fitting on the actual data, and this is the extrapolation of the curve out below the actual data. And here's the killer. This was the air temperature at which Challenger launched, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll leave the effect of that graph to deliver the message. Why is display important? It was terribly important. And these were engineers and managers. All right, moving on to the trilogy, mathematics, art, and message. I whimsically call it Zen and the art of measurement graphics. Mathematics, when you're doing measurement display, the mathematics are what everybody is familiar with, the data and the formulas.